some testable results that we see here. They give us a way to kind of think about the market. The goal of future research will be to introduce more complexity. An obvious thing that I haven't talked about and don't address in this is the issue of bargaining power by households, right? You know, there's the Palmer Wood and others have long talked about the issue of water lords and monopoly power in the water market. So these are future extensions that I hope to adapt in. But at this point, you know, still just a PhD candidate. Got to get a job first.
Who owns groundwater?
No one.
And what gives the seller the right to sell? And then are the contracts written or verbal? That's where your research problem starts.
Yep. Yeah. So there is no written contracts in the survey that I undertook last year with Cider Ramen. You may know. We asked, you know, are your contracts written or verbal? Everyone says no one has written contracts. I was hoping to get some written contracts so we could explore that variation between written and verbal. There's none. The other issue is who owns the water and who has what gives them the right to sell. No one owns the water, which is why this is an interesting problem, right? When farmers use a piece rate contract, they're only actually paying for the diesel, not the water. Randy made this point to me yesterday, is people aren't interested in conserving water, they're interested in conserving diesel fuel, right? You know, the marginal cost of pumping water is simply the price of fuel. There's actually no cost to the water itself because no one owns the water. And the only thing that gives someone the right to pump that water is that they've been wealthy enough to put a shallow tube well in.
So I think that's where the research problem starts. How did the seller acquire the right to sell when the water doesn't belong to anybody? How?
Wealth. Right? They're richer. So that's the I could quickly skip ahead just to hopefully answer your question. That's the actually the very last slide is raising this question. So by what I've gone through so far gives a theoretical way to describe the market for water. Once we have this, we can then explore questions like yours. Is, you know, it seems like the piece rate might be the best type of contract because you're actually paying for the water you get. But as Randy said, you're not paying for the water you get, you're paying for the fuel that's used. And so while a piece rate might be most incentive compatible, you're not actually paying the true cost of the water. So, you know, Eleanor Ostrom and others have long talked about the common pool resource problem, the tragedy of the commons, ways to address that. But in the empirical stuff that I quickly just skipped over to get to this point, increasing village level governance, forming cooperatives to manage the groundwater so that it's not overly exploited to solve this common pool resource problem. It means increasing the level of governance, but we find that increasing governance makes people less likely to pay the true cost of water and more likely to use this output share crop as some sort of enforceable contract. So we end up with this bind, is that when we go to try and solve one problem, managing the water, we end up with another problem because stronger governance means less relational contracts and less optimal outcomes in the delivery of water. And so the research is trying to look at, well, there's these competing issues. There's the competing issue of food security versus groundwater conservation. There's the competing issue of appropriately managing a common pool resource versus providing optimal water or finding optimal contracts for groundwater. So how does one balance all of these different competing issues? And so in the issue in the groundwater market, you know, there hasn't really been a lot of a lot of theoretical work. You know, in land tenure, we have a good idea of what's going on because we've had Nobel Prize winners write articles about land tenure contracts. We've had that Hayami and Otsuka book that describes or generates this kind of general theory about land tenure contracts. And from that theoretical framework, you can ask a whole host of questions and say, oh, well, what about this? You can look at the theory and you can derive some results, and then you can test them and see, well, does that actually, does theory actually mimic action, or does action mimic theory, or is it just nonsense? That hasn't been done yet for groundwater markets, and so this is a very initial step at trying to do something like Hayami and Otsuka, build up a theory of groundwater markets from within which we can ask a whole host of very interesting questions, as opposed to trying to address it piecemeal. So that's another point I try and make, is this idea of adopting a systematic approach to analyzing the market. Additional questions? All right, so I did the survey. Well, amazing. Saidur did the survey. I helped them out a little bit. I tagged along. We surveyed 960 villages. I have some descriptive statistics here about interesting elements in our survey data. Given that it's 11:15, I'll skip over these. And basically, well, you know, what's interesting is we have a lot of variety within a village of how, and across villages, of how contracts are enforced, right? So this is a graph of enforcement mechanisms. About half of all villages provide no sort of enforcement, right? They just leave it up to the contracting parties. It's up to them. The other half have some sort of enforcement, and those differ. Mainly it's village elders or village councils that enforce contracts. Right? We also, given that there is enforcement, we have a variety of different types of enforcements: social ostracism, some sort of economic fine, or a privately determined amount of payment or penalty. So this variety gives us an opportunity to explore a lot of variation within villages and a lot of variation across villages. So we just specify a very simple probit model. What we're interested in is a relational contract used or is it not? And the probability that a relational contract is used is going to be determined by the discount rate, this performance signal. How accurate is my provision of water to you, a measure of your crop output? The degree of village enforcement, how severely punished are cheaters? And then a couple vectors of characteristics. So whether it's a deep tube well or a shallow tube well, how wealthy the other person is, the other person has social power over someone to try and control for bargaining power. And we have to do an instrumental variable approach because there's some endogeneity in the model. So the results, I only show results for the variables that we're interested in: this discount rate, this performance signal, and this punishment. Discount rate, not particularly significant unless we instrument for it. Soil quality is our measure of performance signal. The assumption here is if you have better soil quality, you're going to, the measure, if you have better soil quality, it'll increase the probability that my provision of water to you results in good crop output. If you have really bad soil, I could provide exactly the right amount of water and the crop could still fail. But if you have good soil quality, the chances of my providing good water, the chance of you having good production based on my provision of water is fairly high. So we find that good soil quality or better soil quality decreases the use of relational contracts, which is what we expect. And we find very strong evidence that severe punishment for cheaters results in people using enforceable contracts. If you know that you're going to be punished if you cheat on an enforceable contract, you're more likely to use that contract because you know no one's going to be stupid enough to cheat. So basically, we don't have a lot of strong evidence on the discount rate, but our other theoretical results, we do have strong evidence, at least empirically. What you also might be interested in is how things vary within a given village. So the village has enforcement or the village does not enforce contracts. How do things change when you move from a fixed charge to an output share to a piece rate contract? As you would expect, since fixed charge and piece rate are both relational contracts, punishment doesn't matter because you can't punish someone for those contracts. But when you look at output share, an enforceable contract compared to a relational contract, punishment does matter. So this is just a way to provide robustness to our initial results. We see that if we chop up the contracts as 3 different types, we get results that we would expect. So returning to these research questions, the empirical evidence is mixed in the case of discount rates and fairly strong in these other 2 comparative static results. So, and this is a part where I need your input also, is do you believe these policy implications and do you think that they matter? So, generally speaking, how to design interventions or new market mechanisms that ensure conservation while continuing high boral rice output. So that's the ultimate goal. Here I've only described a method to get to that goal. One is adopt a more systematic approach to analyzing the market, something similar to what has been done in land tenure markets. Another thing is that policies need to consider the governance structure. Right? You don't want to say, oh, well, all you need to do is write down an actual contract and that will be a way to solve it if there's no one to enforce that contract. Right? You're going to need to provide market or incentives that are self-enforcing, that don't require outside enforcement. And another result, which I kind of glossed over up till now, is that attempts to strengthen governance may result in suboptimal outcomes. So attempts to capacity build in the legal system may result in people using enforceable contracts instead of relational contracts. Specifically to the water markets in South Asia, if the goal, and this is just I'm not saying this is the goal, but if the goal is to conserve water. In Bangladesh, it's probably not the goal yet, but in some parts of India, it definitely is now the goal. The goal is to conserve water. Then we can look at these 3 types of contracts and say, well, output share wastes the most water. But the reason why people use it is because they may be credit constrained, right? You pay at the end of the season. So I don't have the money now. I'm going to use an output share. I might waste water, but this is the only type of contract I can afford. Fixed charge conserves the most water, but if I can't pay for the water up front, I'm not going to be able to use this. A piece rate balances these 2 issues because I only pay for the water I get. And so I'm likely to conserve water because I have to actually pay for the exact amount of water I get. And I pay for it when the water is delivered, so it's easier if I'm credit constrained. The problem is with this piece rate contract, it doesn't really account for the true price of water. What you're paying for is the price of fuel or the price of electricity. And especially in India, in Bangladesh, electricity for water is highly subsidized. So you're not even paying the true cost of the electricity. So you might say, based on this research, piece rate, that's the best. But if you think a little ahead, piece rate doesn't pay for the true cost of water. And as I was saying just a few minutes ago, if we try and get people to pay for the true price of water, if we try and make this solve this common pool resource problem, the way Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom proposes solving it is to form these kind of community cooperatives, this governance structure to punish people when they overuse water. What my research ends up showing is that better governance in managing the common pool resource may conserve water, but it may have or will have suboptimal effects on crop output or water use in providing crop output. So again, we come back to this bind, or this kind of paradox, this trade-off that we have to face is, well, we want to do, whoop, sorry, I keep missing the buttons. We want to do this, and so we've heard we should do this, but we might end up with just a different problem. So how do we, especially as a rice, people interested in growing rice, how do we balance all these competing incentives? How do we balance all these competing problems? How do we continue the green revolution, or move forward the second green revolution and produce more and more rice while also conserving water? These things seem to be diametrically opposed, and how do we, especially as social scientists, because the plant breeders aren't interested in this, we as social scientists, this is our problem to solve. This is our contribution to make. So how do we, as social scientists, try and understand this balance, or try and balance these competing issues? That's all I have.
Thanks, Jeff, for an interesting talk on irrigation contracts and analysis of your results for the groundwater irrigation markets in Bangladesh and policy implications of your research. Questions?
Thank you, Jeff. That was very interesting. Two quick questions. The very first one, I understand this survey was done just at one time, right? It's a cross-sectional.
Correct.
Yeah, how about the dynamic in this whole aspect? Have you had any situation where some of those farmers have switched into different contract over time? That's the very first one. Second is, I understand many of those farmers are having several plots. Do they actually apply different contract on different plots? Do you have any thought of this situation, and have you accounted for it?
Yep. Okay, so the first question, I would love to go back. If Sam was here, I would be begging him for money to go back and turn this into a panel data. Because I think there's probably a lot going on here that I can't account for, that may be driving some of the results. I honestly am not a huge believer in the validity of my results. They too closely align with the theoretical results, right? And as an economist, I want that to be true, but as a human, I know that we very rarely behave like the mathematical models say we behave. So when the empirical results align too closely with the theoretical predictions, I begin to question that. It's a cross-section, so I can't really control for the dynamics. What we did ask is, how long have you been contracting with the same person? And so I run another regression that only looks at farmers that have switched sellers in the recent past and farmers that haven't switched in the recent past. And I look at those two, and I don't show those because those are more messy, which again leads me to believe that the cross-section is too naive and that there are dynamics that I don't have the data to account for. I only have these kind of measures of, have you switched sellers or have you not? The other question is, do sellers or do water buyers have multiple plots? Yes, water buyers have several different plots, and so they end up contracting with several different individuals. And it's often the case that I may own, or you may own a well and provide water to one area, but you have a plot that isn't close to your well, and so you have to buy water from me for that plot. So you're both a water buyer and a water seller. This is difficult to control for, but it does have the benefit that there doesn't appear to be a lot of the monopolistic price gouging that one would expect, because if you're selling, if I have a plot across the street and you have a plot and a well across the street, and I have a well here and you have a plot here, I'm not going to gouge you in the price of water because I have to buy water from you across the street. And so while only the middle and wealthy income households can own wells, there doesn't seem to be a lot of price gouging because the market tends to be fairly well integrated, because everyone is buying, everyone who's selling is also buying at some place, and so that has a price dampening effect. But I'd love to have a spatial model.
Yeah, I was going to come to that.
My question might sound stupid to you and to the audience, but I wonder if you will be looking at groundwater depletion and how the user extraction cost will vary with that, and how would you judge, based on those parameters, what the possible optimum contract would be?
Yep. So that's something that I want to explore in the future. There's evidence, hydrological evidence. I'm not a hydrologist, but I've been told that in some areas water extraction is now, or aquifer depletion has now exceeded aquifer recharge. So there's not problems yet in groundwater availability, but there's signs that it will become a problem. We also asked villagers and farmers what the height of how far they had to go down to get water 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and today, and there's clearly they have to go deeper and deeper. The aquifer levels are falling. So what you're asking requires a kind of a dynamic programming model. It requires a model that accounts for the dynamics, kind of what Val was saying, in water management. And I've begun to look at that, but I don't have a clear understanding of how I can integrate that into this setting. I think what will probably have to happen is I have to keep, the two things will end up being separate elements, and we'll look at what's the optimal water use, and knowing that, then we'll go back to this model and think, okay, given certain governance structures, given certain discount rates, we know the target amount of water we want to use, how do we design a contract that gets us to that? And so that's kind of what I'm talking about with this more systematic approach. Instead of just doing one or the other, we try and integrate them to account for both the hydrological conditions, the growing conditions of rice itself. How much water does rice need? Maybe the optimal water use is a thimbleful. Well, that's not going to be very helpful in actually growing crops in the boreal season. So we need to consider the hydrological aspects, the biological aspects of growing rice. We also need to consider the social aspects of why people choose types of contracts. We might say, well, this is the best type of contract, but it requires a lot of upfront money. Well, that's not going to work if people don't have money until harvest season. So we need to kind of think of all these things and try and integrate them into a system.
One question actually, you talked about 3 different types of constant. Yeah. Yes? I'll talk about it now. So you have three types of contracts. Is there a lot of variation within contracts? If you talk about shares, is the share always the same? Or is there, and if you talk about a fixed price, is a fixed price always the same? Or is it each time negotiated between the buyer and the seller?
So the model allows for variation in prices or in the payments. Within a village, well, so actually across Bangladesh, there is slight variation in the output share. And I can't quite tell why. I need a panel to actually be able to tell why the variation is there. There's also variation in the fixed charge price across Bangladesh. Within a given village, there seems to be the social norms that define what the price is.
Yeah.
And so for the prices within a village don't vary significantly. What determines those village norms is unclear. I think, in talking to Saidor, this is what he thinks also, is especially with the output share, people use that because they understand that contract from land tenure, right? People use output share contracts for land tenure all the time. And they pay a certain amount of their product for that, and this is a well-established contract form. And so I think the price of water there is somewhat state dependent on what the percentage that they've paid for land in the past.
So, but there are within the village, everybody pays more or less the same.
More or less the same, yes,
Okay.
yeah. It varies, but it's 30% to 40%, so
Yeah.
within a 10% range.
So around that, there's no need for fixing things like Like that the price of water should be.
Yeah, so well, so that's what I was saying. There doesn't seem, because of the integration of the market, there doesn't seem to be a lot of price gouging. But just because this society has determined this is the normal price,
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're actually paying the true cost of water,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
That's completely
Um,
different.
Yep. So the price may not be the price that we want them to pay, or maybe it is, because think of how many lives have been saved since the famine and the war in Bangladesh in '71. Some of that's due to really cheap prices for fuel and electricity, so that they can pump water.
There's the demand for water seasonally. Everybody wants water at the same time,
Yep.
you know, like for flowering or for transplanting. How do you, is there a lot of conflict in these, between the buyer and seller in terms of, I'm not getting my water in time?
Yep. So we asked questions in the survey. Did you get the right amount of water you wanted? Did you get it, and did you get it when you wanted? And how often didn't you get it when you wanted? And almost everyone, at some point in the season, did not get water when they wanted to. The only even people who pay exactly when they get the water didn't get it. They would come and say, "I need water now. Here's the money," and the person would say, "I have to provide water to my own plot today. You can get it two days from now or whatever." Luckily, with rice, you know, there's a couple day leeway, but again, like you said, there's a constraint in providing water when it's needed. And so, returning to kind of the social aspects of the problem, it might not be an issue of when do we start depleting the aquifers. It might be an issue of when does water demand become so high that we can't provide it adequately at the right amount of time. So there might be enough water down there, there's just not enough ways to raise it to the surface. And so these contracts, and this is something that is implicit in the work, is I just didn't talk about it today, is some of these contracts are more incentive compatible than others. If I've paid you up front for water, or we'll continue with me as the water seller. If you've paid me up front for water, and Val is paying me an output share, and you both want water today. Well, you've already given me the money. You've already given me the money, and Val is only going to pay me based on what he actually produces. Well, I'm going to give the water to Val because my payment is contingent on me providing water to Val now. And so you're going to get shuffled to the back of the line. And so these contracts depend or differ along, you know, what's incentive compatible, or if you can get water when you want it.
Okay, give two suggestions here. I would really encourage you to look at the spiritual version of those regression, because I highly suspect that the choice of those type of contract will also be influenced by what the neighbors are doing. They all live in the same community, so I will expect some sort of spiritual dependency there. That's number one. When you get back to Pedro, I'm sure there's a lot of resources there to help you on that. Second is, I really want to come back to the point made by Dr. Castillo earlier. Nobody has ownership over the water, but what exactly drive those guys, the seller, to go and start the business? And there's also a locational aspect. What exactly is driving the choice of a location where they actually settle to sell the water? That could be also another thing to investigate. If you go back to your locational theory, I think that would be a very interesting thing to look at in the future.
Okay, I understood that this is the last question. Okay, any relationship with fishing? In Myanmar, I've seen very complex contracts because of the competition between, rice farming and fisheries. So I understood that Bangladesh is a bit the same, that delta. So, are you planning to look into those relationships?
So, I want to. In one of the VDSA villages, has switched basically to almost exclusive aquaculture. We excluded all of those villages for simplicity in the survey. So we only went to villages that don't have aquaculture. They're simply irrigating for boro rice. Ideally, I would like to go back and look at villages where there's a purpose competition, right? Where I can grow this or this, and depending on the price of water, the price of water will determine which one I produce to some extent. behind it. I'd love to look at that and see how contracts are designed.
We have exceeded the time, so for those who still have questions, you can talk to Jeff, and he's here until
Tomorrow. I think
tomorrow.
tomorrow.
Okay, so we've had a very interesting discussion and
Thank you all
interesting
for
talk. Please join me
listening.
in thanking Jeff.